Imagine being told that the government is offering you free medical care, no cost, no strings attached. You trust the doctors. You show up for checkups. You believe someone is finally looking out for you. But what if that promise was a lie? Between 1932 and 1972, the U.S. Public Health Service conducted what is now known as the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment. Nearly 600 black men in rural Alabama were enrolled. Many already carried a serious illness, yet they were never told the truth about their condition. They believed they were being treated. In reality, they were being watched. This was not a short-term study. It lasted 40 years, spanning generations, wars, and medical breakthroughs. During that time, effective treatment became widely available. Lives could have been saved. Families could have been spared loss. But the men in this study were kept in the dark, valued not as patients, but as data. What makes this story even more unsettling is not just what happened, but who allowed it to happen. Doctors, government institutions, Cleanse, a system that claimed to protect public health, yet failed the very people who trusted it most. The experiment unfolded quietly, hidden from public view, while the participants believed they were receiving care. This story is not just about the past. Its consequences still echo today in trust, in memory, and in the relationship between communities and medicine. To understand why, we must first understand what was hidden, who was harmed, and why it was allowed to continue for so long. In this video, we're going to uncover the full story behind the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment step by step, so we can understand its impact, its lessons, and why it still matters. If you value honest storytelling, forgotten history, and deep dives into real events that shaped the world we live in today, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Let's begin. What happened next was not an accident, nor a misunderstanding, but a carefully maintained illusion that stretched on for decades. After earning the trust of the men in Macon County, the study's organizers created a narrative that sounded reassuring and familiar. The participants were told they were being treated for something called bad blood, a vague term commonly used at the time to describe a range of ailments. It sounded harmless, almost routine, and it spared the men from asking questions that might have revealed the truth. To them, this was simply a medical program meant to help, not a long-term experiment designed to observe suffering. The men returned year after year, believing the government doctors were caring for their health. They underwent examinations, blood tests, and procedures that appeared legitimate, all reinforcing the idea that treatment was underway. Small comforts were offered to maintain compliance: free meals on visit days, transportation to clinics, and burial assistance for their families. These gestures, modest as they were, carried enormous weight for poor rural workers who had little access to health care of any kind. Trust deepened, and with it, dependence. Behind the scenes, however, the purpose of the study had quietly shifted. What was initially presented as a treatment program became a long-term observation of how the disease progressed when left untreated. The men were never informed of this change, nor were they given the opportunity to refuse participation. Their bodies became records, their suffering became data, and their lives were reduced to numbers in medical reports. By the 1940s, medical science had reached a turning point. Penicillin emerged as a reliable and widely accepted cure, transforming the outlook for those affected by the illness. Across the country, patients were recovering, resuming their lives, and escaping the long-term damage that the disease could cause. Yet for the men in this study, that breakthrough never arrived. Despite its availability, the treatment was deliberately withheld. The silence was intentional, and the deception continued. Even more troubling was the active effort to preserve that silence. Local physicians were discouraged from providing treatment to the participants, ensuring the study could continue uninterrupted. The men, unaware of the medical advances taking place around them, trusted that what they were receiving was sufficient. They had no reason to believe otherwise. Each visit reinforced the same message: everything was under control. As years passed, the consequences became impossible to ignore. Health deteriorated slowly, then dramatically. Some men developed severe complications. Others lost the ability to work, and families watched their loved ones change without understanding why. Wives and children were never told the full truth either, even as the illness quietly spread within households. What had begun as a promise of care turned into a lifetime of unanswered questions. The true tragedy lies not only in the withholding of treatment, but in the calculated way hope was used as a tool of control. The participants believed they were being helped, that their loyalty to the program would lead to better health. Instead, they were trapped in a system that valued observation over intervention, and curiosity over compassion. The experiment persisted not because it was hidden from view, but because those in power chose not to stop it. This chapter of the story reveals how easily authority can be abused when transparency disappears, and how devastating the consequences can be when human lives are treated as expendable. What was denied to these men was not just medicine, but the right to know, to choose, and to protect themselves and their families. The damage unfolded quietly, over years, until the truth could no longer be contained. To fully understand how such deception was possible, it is necessary to look beyond the walls of the clinics and into the world the participants lived in. The study did not emerge in isolation. It was born in an era shaped by rigid racial segregation and deep economic inequality. In the rural South, especially in Alabama, African American communities lived under systems that limited opportunity at every level. Education was scarce, employment options were narrow, and access to medical care was almost non-existent. For many families, seeing a doctor at all was a rare event, not a routine part of life. Most of the men recruited into the study were sharecroppers, bound to the land by poverty and debt. Their daily lives were defined by hard labor and survival, not by access to information or legal protections. Hospitals were often segregated or entirely closed to them, and many medical institutions simply refused to treat black patients. In this environment, the promise of government-sponsored healthcare carried extraordinary power. It sounded not only generous, but almost unimaginable. When officials arrived with credentials, authority, and the backing of respected institutions, their words were rarely questioned. This imbalance of power was not accidental. It was a direct consequence of a system designed to exclude. The men lacked the educational resources needed to challenge medical explanations, and the social structure offered no safe avenue to push back. They were taught, explicitly and implicitly, to trust authority figures and to accept what was offered without resistance. This made them especially vulnerable to manipulation, even when the consequences were severe. The study's organizers understood this reality and took advantage of it. Recruitment efforts were carefully tailored to the community, using language that felt familiar and non-threatening. The term bad blood was deliberately vague, avoiding medical clarity while sounding credible enough to discourage deeper inquiry. By framing the study as a benevolent health initiative, researchers positioned themselves as helpers rather than overseers, reinforcing a narrative that masked exploitation behind routine care. What followed was a relationship built on dependency rather than partnership. The men were not treated as individuals with rights, but as subjects whose circumstances made them convenient for observation. Their limited access to healthcare meant they had nowhere else to turn, and their economic hardship made even small benefits feel significant. This dependence ensured compliance without the need for force or coercion. Silence became easier than resistance. The broader social climate allowed this arrangement to continue unquestioned. Segregation normalized unequal treatment, and the suffering of black communities was often dismissed or ignored by those in power. What might have raised alarms elsewhere was seen as acceptable within a system that already viewed certain lives as less worthy of protection. The absence of accountability was not a failure of oversight alone, but a reflection of whose voices were considered important enough to hear. As years passed, the men aged within the confines of this inequality. Their health declined, their questions went unanswered, and their trust was never rewarded with honesty. Families watched from the sidelines, unaware that the barriers they faced were not just economic or social, but deliberately maintained. The experiment endured because it aligned with a larger pattern of neglect, one that made exploitation easy and intervention unlikely. This part of the story exposes a painful truth. The study succeeded not because of scientific brilliance, but because inequality created the perfect conditions for abuse. When access to care is limited, when education is denied, And when voices are systematically silenced, exploitation can hide in plain sight. The men at the center of this story were not simply victims of a single experiment, but of a society that allowed their vulnerability to be used against them. As the years passed and the study continued uninterrupted, the moral cost of what was happening became impossible to separate from the process itself. At the heart of the experiment was a fundamental violation of medical ethics, one so severe that it reshaped how research would later be governed. The men were never given the information necessary to make an informed choice about their participation. They were not told the true purpose of the study, the nature of their illness, or the risks they faced by remaining untreated. Consent, in any meaningful sense, simply did not exist. Instead, what existed was a carefully controlled flow of information, designed to maintain cooperation rather than understanding. Medical authority was used as a shield, allowing researchers to make decisions on behalf of the participants without their knowledge. Procedures were performed, blood was drawn, and examinations were conducted under the appearance of care, while the truth remained deliberately hidden. The men believed they were patients. The researchers viewed them as observations in progress. This imbalance stripped the participants of autonomy, reducing their role to passive subjects in a study that prioritized outcomes over individuals. Ethical medicine is built on respect for human dignity. Yet dignity was never part of the equation here. The suffering of the men was not an unintended consequence. It was a known and accepted condition of the research. As long as data continued to be collected, their declining health was treated as confirmation rather than a call to intervene. What makes this violation even more striking is that it persisted through periods of growing ethical awareness in medicine. Over the decades, standards evolved, debates intensified, and the importance of patient rights became increasingly clear. Yet the study continued, insulated by institutional approval and professional silence. Internal concerns were raised, but they were dismissed or ignored, suggesting that the pursuit of knowledge had been allowed to outrank the value of human life. The researchers justified their actions by framing the study as scientifically important, arguing that observing the natural progression of the disease would benefit future generations. But this reasoning came at an enormous cost. It assumed that the lives of the participants were acceptable sacrifices for abstract gains, an assumption rooted in the same inequality that made the study possible in the first place. The men were not asked if they were willing to bear that cost. It was decided for them. As complications emerged and conditions worsened, the ethical breach deepened. Each untreated symptom represented another moment when intervention could have occurred but did not. Each year that passed reinforced a system in which data collection outweighed compassion. The researchers were not merely failing to act. They were actively maintaining conditions that allowed harm to continue. In doing so, they crossed a line that medicine exists to protect. The absence of informed consent also extended beyond the individual participants. Families were kept in the dark, unaware of the risks or the truth behind the ongoing medical visits. Opportunities to prevent further harm were lost, not because solutions were unavailable, but because transparency was never considered essential. Knowledge was controlled, and with that control came irreversible consequences. This ethical collapse did not happen suddenly. It unfolded gradually, normalized by routine and reinforced by authority. Over time, the extraordinary became ordinary, and the unacceptable became policy. By the time the truth emerged, decades had passed, and the damage could not be undone. This chapter of the story reveals a chilling reality. When ethics are treated as obstacles rather than foundations, medicine can lose its purpose entirely. The violation was not only procedural, but moral, a reminder that science without accountability can drift far from its duty to heal. What was taken from these men was not just their health, but their right to choose, to know, and to be treated as human beings first. For decades, the study existed in near silence, shielded by bureaucracy and distance from public view. It might have continued even longer, if not for a moment when that silence finally broke. By the early 1970s, the social landscape of the United States was changing. Public trust in institutions was already under strain, and questions about authority were being asked more openly than ever before. It was within this climate that the truth behind the experiment began to surface. The turning point came when information reached the hands of investigative journalists who understood the weight of what they were uncovering. When the story was finally published in 1972, it exposed a reality that was both shocking and undeniable. The public learned that hundreds of men had been observed for decades, while effective treatment was intentionally withheld, all under the authority of a government health agency. The reaction was swift and intense, not because the facts were complex, but because they were impossible to justify. Across the country, outrage spread. Communities that had long suspected mistreatment now saw their fears confirmed. Medical professionals, civil rights leaders, and ordinary citizens alike condemned the study as a profound betrayal of trust. What had once been hidden behind technical language and institutional approval was now visible to everyone, and the moral failure was unmistakable. The experiment could no longer be defended as a matter of science when its human cost was laid bare. Under mounting pressure, the federal government moved to contain the damage. Congressional hearings were called to investigate how such a study had been allowed to continue for so long without intervention. Testimonies revealed layers of oversight failures, institutional complacency, accolade, and decisions that prioritized continuity over conscience. Officials were forced to confront not only what had happened, but why warnings had been ignored and accountability had been absent. The study was officially terminated that same year, ending 4 decades of observation that should never have begun. For the men who survived, the conclusion came far too late. Many were elderly and suffering from advanced health complications that could have been prevented. Treatment was finally offered, but it could not reverse years of decline or restore what had been lost. The end of the experiment marked a legal and administrative resolution, not a moral one. In the years that followed, survivors and their families sought justice through the courts. A lawsuit resulted in financial settlements and a promise of ongoing medical care for those affected, including family members who had also suffered consequences. While the compensation acknowledged wrongdoing, it could not measure the full extent of the harm. Money could not replace health, erase trauma, or restore decades of trust that had been broken. The exposure of the experiment forced the nation to reckon with uncomfortable truths about its institutions. New regulations were introduced, and ethical standards for medical research were strengthened in response. These changes were framed as progress, yet they stood as reminders that reform often comes only after harm has already been done. The safeguards put in place were built on the suffering of those who had been denied basic rights. This chapter of the story represents more than a revelation. It marks a moment when secrecy gave way to accountability. The work of investigative journalism did not merely end a study, but exposed a system that had allowed it to exist. The consequences reshaped medical ethics and public awareness, leaving behind a legacy that continues to influence how research, trust, and responsibility are understood today. The end of the experiment did not bring an end to its consequences. Long after the files were closed and the hearings concluded, the damage continued to ripple outward, shaping attitudes, persistent decisions, and fears that still exist today. One of the most enduring legacies is a deep mistrust of the medical system within African American communities. A mistrust rooted not in rumor or misunderstanding, but in lived history. When trust is broken so profoundly, it does not simply return with time. For many families, the story of the experiment became a warning passed quietly from one generation to the next. It influenced how people viewed doctors, hospitals, and government health programs, seeking medical care, participating in research, or accepting new treatments often carried an unspoken question. Will this really help me? Or, will I be harmed again? That hesitation, born from experience rather than fear, has had real consequences. Delayed diagnosis, termination demands, reduced participation in clinical trials, and skepticism toward public health initiatives have all contributed to ongoing disparities in health outcomes. These disparities are not solely the result of individual choices. They are deeply connected to history, access, and trust. When a community has been repeatedly overlooked, excluded, or exploited, confidence in systems meant to provide care erodes. The experiment became a symbol of that erosion, reinforcing the belief that medical institutions could not always be relied upon to act in good faith. Even decades later, Its shadow remains present in conversations about healthcare equity and justice. At the same time, the story stands as a lasting warning. It shows what can happen when research is driven by prejudice rather than principle, and when human beings are reduced to data points. Ethical guidelines. Service hint. Informed consent laws and oversight committees now exist in part because of this failure. Yet rules alone are not enough. They must be supported by accountability, transparency, and a commitment to seeing every patient as fully human. The legacy of the experiment forces an uncomfortable but necessary reflection. Progress in medicine must never come at the expense of dignity. Scientific advancement loses its meaning when it is built on suffering that could have been prevented. Remembering this history is not about assigning blame forever, but about ensuring that the same patterns are never repeated under different names or circumstances. For the families affected, the story is not an abstract lesson, but a personal one. It represents lost years, broken trust, and questions that can never be fully answered. Honoring their experience means more than acknowledging what went wrong. It means actively working toward a healthcare system that is fair, transparent, and worthy of trust for everyone. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story and reflect on its meaning. If you found this video valuable and believe these stories deserve to be remembered and understood, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and staying with us for more in-depth explorations of history that still shapes the world today.